been a while, wasn't it? Yeah, I've gotten myself a 9 to 5 some time ago, and yeah, let's not talk about this. I'm going to tell you about how this cute anime about high schoolers playing some card game is actually about them playing with the medieval equivalent of dick pics, basically. No jokes here. Today I'm going to tell you about the origins of the poems used in Chihayafuru, the card game that they play in Chihayafuru, and how it's basically a medieval way in which people try to get laid. So, as always, let's start with the basics. So, what karuta actually is, and what the rules are, and how it came to be. There are many card games in Japanese culture, and the one that they play in Chihaya would more specifically be called Uta Karuta, meaning the poetry karuta. It was created somewhere around the beginning of the 20th century and was originally played around the New Year's Eve as a form of entertainment. I'm not going to go into details about the rules as the anime goes through them many times, but the basic rule is that the player needs to find a card with a second half of the poem when the first half is read by the reader. In order to be able to do that, you need to memorize 100 poems that the game consists of. They are tanka poems from an anthology called Chōyaku Hyakunin isshu, which was compiled by Fujiwara no Teika. It was created in the 13th century and it consisted of the poems from the best Japanese poets at the time, with the oldest one of them living in the 7th century and the most recent one in the 13th. This means that this anthology basically showcased poems from 3 distinctive periods of Japanese history, but most of them, and the best known of them, were created in the Heian period and are heavily connected with life of Japanese aristocracy and court at the time, and what they deemed beautiful and worth writing about. And unlike here in Europe, that would be mostly, well, sex. Yeah, medieval Europe would never. I'm exaggerating a bit, of course, because the poems treated about what people at the time thought was beautiful, so a lot of them talk about nature, but also they were used a lot as a way to communicate with your lovers as well. Plural, multiple, like in, one person could have 2 wives, a few concubines, lovers. Yeah, people who had much more interesting love lives than we do now. Or maybe I do. Medieval Japan was nothing like medieval Europe, when in Europe you would be an outcast for even a suspicion of not being a virgin, or if you were too pretty you could even burn at the stake. In Japan it was considered abnormal to be a virgin, and having lovers was actually socially acceptable. Saying that poems from karuta were about sex is a bit of a stretch, obviously, because there is nothing graphic in them, but they were certainly a way in which people at the time flirted with one another and tried to impress each other and get into each other's pants, basically. So let me tell you a little bit more about what love life at the Heian court actually looked like, so we could put a little bit more perspective on the fact that Chihaya was actually throwing around a medieval equivalent of today's sex. Why can I say that word? Pics. Should I do the sped up version of Heian History 101 then? Yeah, alright.
This period of Japanese history took place from 794 till 1185, and it was basically almost the 400 years of peace that started with that girl from one of my previous videos, almost selling away the imperial family bloodline for that one monk's sweet. The Buddhist monks at the time became too powerful, so the higher-ups from the Nara court made a decision to move the capital from the center of the religion, Nara, a bit further away so they wouldn't have such a big influence on the officials and aristocracy. That's how Heian-kyo, today's Kyoto, came to be. It was a very peaceful period of time in history, with almost no wars and conflicts, which allowed Japanese culture, art, and literature to bloom. Beauty was the most important part of the aristocratic culture at the time, and basically anything they deemed ugly was not welcomed there. It was very important to be in par with the standards of the higher class and the life at the court, so people at the time lived by aesthetic standard called mono no aware.
Well, rich people did, because peasants didn't have time to think about what beauty is. Is my calligraphy whimsical enough, or should I rewrite it? They didn't have time for that. They had the rice to grow for all those bored aristocrats who had nothing better to do than just sit around and try to get laid, basically.
I'm so happy for them.
Me too. So happy for them.
I'm so happy and not at all jealous.
Of course, they were writing it also for the artistic side of things. Mono no aware is a very important term in Heian culture. It is a standard of Japanese aesthetics at the time. It can be translated to a pathos of things, or empathy towards things, or awareness of transience of things, which made life in Heian court just as angsty as you could imagine. Japanese culture in general finds beauty in aging and passing of things, and in sadness connected with that change. This is exactly why cherry blossoms are a very important element of the Japanese culture, as they bloom for a very, very short period of time, which symbolizes mono no aware, basically. Everything that lasts a very short period of time is immediately elevated into the higher level of beauty, basically, in the eyes of the Japanese, and especially in the eyes of the Heian period Japanese people. Mono no aware is much more complicated and richer term, of course, but for the sake of this video, I think it could be enough of an explanation, as it already gives you a perspective on why love affairs, and especially very sad and tragic love affairs, were romanticized and socially accepted at the time. There was basically nothing beautiful in a long-lasting marriage with someone of the same status as you, but a steamy love affair with your sister's husband, who maybe, just maybe, could be even a lower status than you, and has a brother. There is very little to nothing known about the life of regular Japanese people of Heian period, because people who had time to write anything were almost exclusively aristocrats, and they wrote about other aristocrats. They weren't really interested in the regular ugly life of normal people. They were only interested in the things they thought of as beautiful, and life of peasants wasn't that. One of these things that they thought was worth writing about was obviously romance, and so we have an abundance of poems, stories and diaries talking about it, and showing with details how love life of medieval Japanese aristocrats looked like. So we don't even have to speculate on what they did or didn't do, they can just tell us that themselves. We know that Heian society was polygamous. Of course, women only could have one husband, but a guy could have multiple wives and concubines.
You got married again.
Yes?
There would always be a first, main wife, which would most of the time have as good upbringing as possible to help with the husband's social status. And then he would also have a couple of secondary wives, or if he liked a particular girl who unfortunately wasn't of a acceptable breed, didn't have a good enough social status for him, he could make her his concubine. And that happened a lot, obviously, because if you wanted to get this better social status, you would just have to marry a girl from a good family. But then, if you liked a peasant girl from like a neighborhood village, you could just make her your concubine and that's fine. And that's classist as hell, obviously. But at the time, being basically an aristocrat certified side chick was better than marrying in your own class, I guess. Though if there really was a big difference between the concubine and the guy, and if the aristocrat liked the girl, the low status girl, much more than his other wives, yeah, the girl would get bullied because the rest of the court and aristocrats would think it was so distasteful. Because the concubines weren't a secret at all wives and concubines knew about each other. Most of the time there was a lot of jealousy going on in this weird family-like dynamic. Though saying the girls in the arrangement were a family is a stretch. Most of the time they didn't even live under the same roof. Women after marriage would stay at their own homes with their parents, and the husbands would just visit them from time to time to knock her up, basically, and live with her a little bit, and then move on to the next one. The husband was obligated to stay the longest period of time with his first wife, though. Through that, however, women had the biggest influence on the next generations, as they were almost exclusively raising the kids in their parents' house. And the husbands would just go from one wife to another wife to a concubine, and actually they were kind of homeless, going from one house to the other. Marriages weren't always forever, though. Divorces were not that uncommon at the time, and if the guy wanted to get rid of the girl, he could divorce her just as quickly as he married her, basically. And actually, rules of taking a wife in the first place were a bit much. Quick and efficient, but much. Apparently, if the guy wanted to marry a girl, all he had to do was court her a little bit with letters with cute poems, then go mess around with her 3 times in a row, 3 nights in a row, and then just let himself get caught the 3rd night in the morning. That's it. And to get the divorce, it was just as quick. The guy or a girl, because it worked both ways there, one party of the marriage would just need to communicate to the other that they don't want that anymore, and the guy would just stop showing up to the girl's house. That's it. Divorce, you're free to remarry again. Easy, convenient, quick, cheap, no lawyers, no court fees. We should really learn from them. But wives and concubines were not the only lovers a handsome nobleman could have in his life. He could also have a bunch of just normal lovers, one-night stands, unofficial side chicks, whatever. Also, it's not only men who could have such lavish lifestyles and love lives. Girls could also have lovers too, and it was completely normal. Everyone would know about them, and it wasn't a taboo at all, though it was polite to pretend as if you didn't know. I mean, they lived in the houses from wood and paper. Obviously, everyone in the house knew that there was a lovesick guy in the middle of the night in the daughter's room next door. But it was customary for the gentleman to leave the house before sunrise so that it wouldn't be too obvious, and I guess so that he wouldn't marry the girl accidentally. The art of courtship, though, was really an art. They would send each other letters, poems, would try to woo their lovers with their calligraphy, poetry, and even knowledge of art or literature. If even one stroke of a brush was not perfect, the other person could quickly lose interest. They were very, very demanding regarding those love letters. Even the quality of a paper mattered there and could be a cock blocker. Also, there was this weird play of, oh, you can't see my face because I'm too precious to be shown publicly, but oh, here is my ankle. If you want to see more, just come to my room at midnight and maybe I'll show. Guys would need to woo the girl sometimes for the longest time before she would allow them to do the, fated 3 nights in a row. But there was absolutely no forcing yourself on the girl. They were too precious for society to basically allow it. Aristocrats' daughters would never leave the mansions because they were very, very cherished and sheltered. Basically, they were the jewels of the house because a guy would never be an emperor. That would never happen, ever. But the girl could be the emperor's next wife or a concubine. Big-brained. But because of this, they would always be behind screens, sheltered from the outside world, so the visitors could only catch a glimpse of them at most. So a lot of the times, the first time the lovers could actually see each other would be during their first night together. Before that, the guy would need to try really hard to convince the woman, because they would be playing this game of maybe I want you or maybe I don't. Try again. It was not in good taste to get yourself wooed that quickly, so basically they were going old tsundere on the poor guys that couldn't even see their faces most of the time. But the thing is, men liked it. As I said previously, Japanese didn't like the perfect things. They didn't like easy, perfect romance. No, they needed the misery and the heartache for the romance to be beautiful and worth it. So we had a bunch of masochistic guys and tsundere girls there. Okay, I guess not that much has changed then. I know it sounds like a fanfic straight from Wattpad, but I brought evidence from my favorite person from the period called Sei Shonagon. She was a lady at the Heian court, obviously, and now she is most known for writing a very witty and blunt diary, which is now considered a Japanese classic, and it's called the P.O. book. So I will read you a few of her, very interesting opinions on life and what was going on around her, basically, at the time. So this is an entry 14th, and it's titled Hateful Things. The thing is, this entry is like 6 pages long, so she really hated a lot of stuff. So I'm not gonna read you all of them, because that would be way too much. I'm just gonna read the most interesting ones. And the ones on love life mostly, obviously. An admirer has come on a... What's that word?
Clandestine, clandestine, clandestine.
The admirer has come on a clandestine visit, but the dog catches sight of him and starts barking. One feels like killing the beast. A gentleman has visited one secretly. Though he is wearing a tall, lacquered hat, he nevertheless wants no one to see him. He is so flurried, in fact, that upon leaving he bangs into something with his hat. Most hateful. A certain gentleman whom one does not want to see visits one at home or in the palace, and one pretends to be asleep. But the maid comes to tell one and shakes one awake with a look on her face that says, "What a sleephead!" Very hateful. A man with whom one is having an affair keeps singing the praises of some woman he used to know. Even if this is a thing in the past, this can be very annoying. True. I hate people whose letters show that they lack respect for worldly civilities, whether by discourtesy in the phrasing or by the extreme politeness to someone who does not deserve it. This is of course most odious if the letters is for oneself, but is bad enough even if it is addressed to someone else. So she's basically here talking about the quality of the letters and how important that is, and she basically thinks that she deserves the best letters ever. Sometimes a person who is utterly devoid of charm will try to create a good impression by using very elegant language, yet he only succeeds in being ridiculous. A lover who is leaving at dawn announces that he has to find his pen and his paper. "I know I put them somewhere last night," he says. Since it is pitch black, he gropes about the room, bumping into furniture and muttering, "Strange, where in the world can they be?" Finally, he discovers the objects. He thrusts the paper into the breast of his robe with a great rustling sound. Then he snaps open his fan and busily fans away with it. Only now is he ready to take his leave. What a charmless behavior! Hateful is an understatement. She really had a lot of opinions about men. Like, this is a very short entry, but she said, "A man who has nothing in particular to recommend him, but who speaks in an affected tone and poses as being elegant." This one I just included because I love how salty she is. Like, it's very clear she didn't like the guy. "A good lover will behave as elegantly at dawn as at any other time. He drags himself out of bed with a look of dismay on his face. The lady urges him on. 'Come on, friend, it's getting light. You don't want anyone to find you here.' He gives a deep sigh as if to say that the night has not been nearly long enough and that it is an agony to leave. Once up, he does not instantly pull on his trousers. Instead, he comes close to the lady and whispers what was left unsaid during the night. Even when he is dressed, he still lingers, vaguely pretending to be fastening his sash." Indeed, one's attachment to a man depends largely on the elegance of his leave-taking. When he jumps out of bed, scurries around the room, tightly fastening his trousers sash, rolls up the sleeves of the court cloak, rover robe, or hunting costume, stuffs his belonging into the breast of his robe, and then briskly secures the outer sash, one really begins to hate him. She just wants her man to live with elegance, okay? She really doesn't spare anyone in this diary. Like, if you really want to know thoughts on society and people of this 10th century savage lady, then I recommend this book. I mean, just look at this entry. It's called Unsuitable Things, and among other things, she says here, "An elderly man with a black beard and a disagreeable expression playing with a little child who has just learned to talk." Why is that wrong? And then my favorite one is very short. "A handsome man with an ugly wife." She's just like, "He hot, you ugly, get out." So this is basically a background of a lot of the poems used in the game Chihaya and the gang plays in Chihayafuru. Obviously not all poems used in karuta were love letters sent to get laid. The poetry was an art and really a hobby of a lot of aristocrats at the time, so they would write poems quite a lot in their free time to polish their craft basically, because good poems could really help you in life and your social status. The better your poetry, the better job you could have, and it could also get you a wife, concubine, lover, or even just one night stand. If you could impress a high-class lady with them, you basically made it in life. That is also why one of the best poets at the time, Ariwara no Narihira, was basically considered a playboy. At the time, being cool and being a playboy basically meant that you were good at poetry, whereas now it would just make you a nerd, I guess. What I'm trying to say, most of the time you're not gonna get laid just because you know how to rhyme. Actually, the most famous poem from the show, Chihayafuru, was written by Narihira himself during one of his affairs. So yeah, I guess Chihayafuru is basically about high schoolers playing with medieval dick pics. Yeah, I can ruin basically any anime for you. You're welcome.
I thought this one guy really liked me and wanted to see me, but then I found out he invited the whole school!